Okay, to orient ourselves again for this next video that we're looking at. Here we're inside the cell, the muscle cell. Here is my blood. Of course, what I need to do is convert my glucose over to ATP energy. So I do that by having glucose come into the cell either directly from the bloodstream or come in and be stored as a product called glycogen. Okay, now obviously our goal is to break this glucose down and to go through cellular respiration or through the processes of glycolysis and hydrolysis of creatine phosphate to form ATP. But we know the big payoff of this is going to be when we go through oxidative phosphorylation is when we will get the most ATP. But of course that requires oxygen. Now, again, glycolysis is the splitting of glucose down into this 3-carbon molecules called pyruvate or pyruvic acid. So we started out with the 6. Look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Ended up with 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 carbon products. That's why they use these symbols. And then, if you'll remember, it took 2 ATP to start, but that was usually what we got from the creatine phosphate. We made 4 ATP from this breakdown of glycolysis. We had to pay back the 2 we started with, so we end up with 2 ATP here. But that pyruvic acid, is the pivotal metabolite. It either will stay out in the cytoplasm or it will go into the mitochondria through the transition or preparatory reaction. Now, what was it that decided whether it did or not? Well, it was whether we had enough oxygen to maintain whatever activity we were doing with this muscle. In this case, we didn't have enough oxygen, so without oxygen, the pyruvate stayed in the cytoplasm instead of going through the transition reaction, and it got converted into lactic acid. And of course, lactic acid is this product that makes us sore, and that's actually also absorbed into the bloodstream, but that's also can be converted back into pyruvate in our rest cycles. Okay, now, but if we do have oxygen, then instead of pyruvate or pyruvic acid being converted to lactic acid, then it will be converted into the acetyl group, and then the acetyl group will join with the coenzyme A and form the acetyl coenzyme A that goes through the Krebs cycle. Okay, here we see the all-important oxygen coming in from our bloodstream, and now if that oxygen's present, then this pyruvic acid, instead of becoming lactic acid, will go into the mitochondria and go through the next step, the Krebs cycle. Now, just like we had glucose that could either come directly from the blood or be stored as this product called glycogen, we have this really important protein in, especially in certain types of muscle fibers, that's called myoglobin. I hope that kind of reminds you of a word called hemoglobin, which is a very similar protein, only is found in red blood cells. And both those proteins have the ability to hang on to oxygen. So myoglobin actually has a chance to store some oxygen that can be used in a cell. So muscles that can basically be fatigue proof, because lactic acid buildup is actually what causes us to feel fatigued. But muscles that can, last for long periods of time and do a lot of endurance activities, they tend to be the muscles that have a lot of this red substance called myoglobin. And yes, it is a red muscle type protein inside of the muscle. So as a matter of fact, we kind of classify certain muscle cells or fibers as either being red muscle fibers or white muscle fibers. And then we can call the red muscle fibers slow twitch and the white muscle fibers fast twitch. Well, of course, if we do go the aerobic pathway with oxygen, then the pyruvate will actually give off one of the carbons. That was the 3 points there, stood for 3 carbons. Remember, acetyl just has 2 carbons, and so when this pyruvate goes to the transition reaction, it loses a carbon dioxide. Well, we lose the other 2 carbons as carbon dioxide during the Krebs cycle, and we also convert the oxygen into water in the 3rd step in oxidative phosphorylation, as the oxygen picks up the electrons from the electron transport chain and then attracts those protons that run back into the matrix. Then it gets converted into water. But more importantly, why are we doing all this? because we only got 2 ATP from glycolysis. We got 2 more ATP from the Krebs cycle, so we end up getting 34 ATP per one original glucose molecule if we go through all 4 steps, especially this oxidative phosphorylation. So we certainly get a lot more ATP energy if we're using oxygen. If we're doing aerobic versus anaerobic situations, we get more oxygen, and we can have more oxygen available if we have myoglobin. The more myoglobin, the more oxygen's available. Here's kind of a running count. We actually get 36 ATP molecules for both Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation, but remember only 2 of those come from the actual Krebs cycle. We get 2 ATP molecules net gain from glycolysis, and we only get 1 ATP molecule for each creatine phosphate because we're simply transferring a phosphate group off the creatine to the ADP to form the ATP. Well, understanding recovering resting is really important, because after we've done an activity, especially an activity where we've used up a lot of glucose and a lot of oxygen, we have to repay that oxygen debt. Therefore, we have to have a time when we actually, get oxygen back into the muscles, back onto the myoglobin. We have to have a time we can even convert the lactic acid back into pyruvic acid, and even at that point use it to make more ATP. And then we have to resynthesize the creatine so we can start the process over if we use it again, or when we use it again, I should say. We also have to use up our restore our glycogen reserves that we've used up. Now, I want you to remember, because I'm going to refer back to this, remember there's some muscle fibers that have a lot of glycogen and some muscle fibers that have a lot of myoglobin. Okay, there's some muscle fibers that may have combinations of both, but most either have a lot of glycogen in them or have a lot of myoglobin. We'll talk about the difference in those next. So here's a cross-section of cells, muscle fibers, muscle cells, same thing. Okay, here's a cross-section of what we would call our white muscle fibers, also called fast twitch muscles, and our red muscle fibers, also called slow twitch fibers. Now, just looking at this, you see that the white muscle fibers are bigger, which means that they are actually stronger. And again, this would almost be like we're looking at a fascicle here. This would be like we're looking at a fascicle here, where, remember, a fascicle is a bundle of muscle cells, and then each muscle cell is kind of separated from the other muscle cells by the endomysium. Okay, now, but these are red or dark because they have a lot of myoglobin. These are large because they have big glycogen reserves. So these red ones that have a lot of myoglobin are going to help us in endurance activities, because if I have myoglobin, I have a lot of oxygen. If I have a lot of oxygen, I can go through cellular respiration and make a lot of ATP. If I don't have a lot of oxygen and myoglobin or mitochondria, then I can still make some ATP, but remember, I can make it through glycolysis. It's just I can't make a lot of it. So I better have a lot of glucose with which to break down to make the ATP that I'm going to need. But yet I'm going to be producing a lot of lactic acid in these if I use up that glycogen reserves, because remember, I'm converting it to lactic acid. I'm not allowing it to go into the mitochondria, where I would need a lot of oxygen to supply that. And then I'm going to have to pay back the oxygen debt either way after I use these. Okay, so muscles that got a lot of white muscle fibers are called fast twitch glycolytic fibers. Fast twitch muscle, and they are white. Why are they white? Because they lack myoglobin or have very little of it, and they have a lot of glycogen. So that these are going to be muscles that we use for speed and power for short duration. So if you think of your limbs or your legs or arms, things that you can usually do heavy activities with, but that you couldn't maintain those forever. Now, if you think about sitting or standing, what muscles would you need to use to sit or stand? Well, you need a lot of back muscles in sitting and standing, and you know, certain muscles that would be in your calf or whatever. So there are certain muscles that are going to be, no matter who you are, they're going to have either higher propensity for white or red fiber. Again, here in the quadriceps and most of the leg muscles and muscles of the arm, pectoralis major and all that, they would be primarily white muscle fibers, even though they would be combinations of white and red. So again, the fast twitch or white muscle fibers, they use mainly glycolysis instead of the whole, you know, they don't really use the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation, but they do make they do make glucose, but not near as much as you could make if you could go through the other processes. But they are much larger in diameter than the red muscle fibers, and so usually the muscles that have that are going to be larger, and but they are going to fatigue rapidly, because when you get lactic acid, you deplete your glycogen, you build up your lactic acid, then it's hard to maintain contractions under those conditions, and it's usually fairly quick. Okay, so that was the white muscle fibers. We were just talking about the fast twitch muscles. However, the red or the slow twitch muscles, they're dark because of their myoglobin. They have a lot of mitochondria because the myoglobin holds extra oxygen. They got a lot of blood vessels around them to deliver the oxygen, and deliver even the oxygen and the glucose to them, because they don't store a lot of glycogen in them like the white muscle fibers, so they need a constant supply of glucose. By the way, they can also use the fatty acids that we talked about from the lipids. Okay, now we're going to especially find a lot of the slow twitch, red muscle fibers, especially in muscles for our posture. Muscles that can hold in place for long periods of time without fatiguing. Again, these slow twitch fibers are the red muscle fibers because they have a lot of myoglobin in them. They mainly use the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation for synthesizing ATP, and we know we always get a lot more. We get 34 ATP from these, whereas glycolysis only gives us 2. Okay, now the actual amount of time that our cross bridges are able to hold the contraction is much longer in our slow twitch than in our fast twitch muscles. So we have high endurance. Even in individual muscles, there can be quite a variation, even in the same muscle. If you take a sprinter versus a marathon, say a world-class sprinter versus a world-class marathon, they're going to have the same muscles, but those muscles would not have the same consistency at the cellular level. A sprinter is going to have a lot more fast twitch white fibers, where a marathoner in the same muscle is going to have a lot more red fibers. So we're going to have muscles that are naturally more one than the other, but even among individuals in the same muscle, we're going to have much of a variation. So you can't, your muscle cells actually don't divide, but the protein inside of them and the fibrils inside of them you can strengthen and actually use to make them more efficiently. But you can't really change your genetics for the most part. There's something called epigenetics that's being studied now that has a few things going on where that might not always be the case. But most of the time, you can't change your genetics for what your muscle are made up of. But what you can do is you can develop whatever combination you have. Not everybody's going to be the world-class marathoner, because not everybody's going to have this ratio. Not everybody's going to actually be the world-class sprinter, because not everybody's going to have this ratio. So, but whatever you have, you can maximize it for you. So, but you do need to understand every muscle is going to have certain combinations of both of these. Now, one last thing. When you order something like chicken, we talk about white meat and dark meat. Well, really, dark meat and white meat is all based on this too. The white meat being a muscle that has a lot of white fiber, dark meat being muscle that has a lot of the red fiber. Even if you look at the breast of a chicken versus the breast of a game bird, the breast of a game bird, where they can fly distances, is going to have a lot more red fiber, where the breast of a chicken would have more white fiber. That's why it's white meat.